What is happening, y'all? Cowboy here, and today we're going to be talking about AI Limit. Now, this is a new Souls-like that's releasing for PlayStation and PC. Was created as part of the China Hero project, which was a PlayStation endeavor to help get basically more Chinese developers into the AAA gaming space with fully fledged titles. This is priced in at only $35, and today we're going to jump in and talk about my experience with it after getting through the entirety of the game. Now, obviously, spoilers are going to be kept to a minimum. In terms of game time, it clocked in right at about 13.5 hours to achieve my first ending. This was with a large amount of the side quests. There's two in particular that I know I did end up missing, and there are other endings to the game, just in terms of setting the stage of what you can expect. But let's dive in and talk about the game, and as always, I like to start things off talking about the gameplay. Now, the gameplay obviously pulls from a lot of familiar Souls-likes, and probably the one that I felt the most relative to was actually Wo Long. So we don't really have a stamina system in this game. The way it works is we have that sync bar that you see that's currently on red right now, and as I attack enemies, that's going to build back up. And so I can use that bar to then execute specials, whether it be spells or it be weapon abilities, but there's no actual stamina system that you need to worry about. So you can freely dodge all over the place. When you're locked onto targets, we have a dash. When you're unlocked, we have a roll. Now, in terms of defensive options, you have three main defensive options that you'll find as you progress through the game. We have a parry, we have a shield that we can hold out, and then we have a basically a spot dodge or a perfectly timed dodge that you can do. And when you time that just right, you'll leave a little clone that can deal some damage. So in terms of the general gameplay and mobility, I do like the way the game flows. You know, we have obviously the just straight regular dodging that you would come to expect in a Souls game. But we do have the more advanced options with the perfect dodge, with the perfect parry, or with the block itself. So the game does give you flexibility in your playstyle. On top of that, I am a really big fan of the idea of basically do damage to do more damage. And what I'm talking about is being able to attack stuff to then build up that sync meter and then execute off specials. Now, obviously not everything is as easy as it looks right now. This is an early portion of the game. This is essentially right after the demo. I'm obviously using the sword from the demo, which ended up being basically my go-to weapon for the majority of the game, as it was one of the few spirit scaling weapons that I discovered. But so everything we encounter here is pretty much going to get just obliterated. I just want to be upfront that the game isn't that easy. I do think it ended up being pretty easy, but we'll talk more about difficulty in a little bit. But just in case you're like, wow, he's insta-killing everything. But from a pure gameplay perspective, I do like the general flow of the game in terms of our character abilities and whatnot. I do wish we had the ability to have on more than one spell. You can have two separate weapons equipped, and then over with our spells, you can have one spell at any given time. And so when we hold down the left trigger, we get access to either our weapon special, the spell that we have equipped, or alternatively, we can swap between our various buffs that we can put on. We also have a offensive option. This one will take a little bit of health to give you a status boost, which then allows you to do red attacks that build up and do piercing damage to enemies. This ended up being extremely good as just the DPS option. So majority of the game, I ended up playing with a combination of both that as well as the timed parry to help lock down bosses. Now, talking about the difficulty a little bit, I do think this is where the game kind of fails to deliver. And, you know, I think I'm not the only one that likes to play Souls-likes because of the difficulty these games tend to offer. Usually there is a high level of challenge, and unfortunately it wasn't really found with this game. I would say in totality, there were maybe 3 bosses that was like, okay, I actually need to, you know, lock in and focus on this. Most of the bosses went down in a single attempt. The ones that didn't usually went down in 2 attempts. So there wasn't really a whole lot of challenge to the gameplay. And the other thing that's really interesting is enemies have very, very low stagger thresholds. And because of this, we could do things like start fighting an enemy and then hit that attack out, and then get 2 attacks and then hit that blast out, and then start attacking again and then get out another laser blade. And there were situations where I was able to just straight lock down bosses. Like, bosses couldn't even fight back. This was especially true early on in the game where I was using a polearm, and there were a couple bosses where I just spammed polearm heavy charged attacks and the boss literally couldn't do anything. They didn't have the ability to get out of the polearm stagger, and the brief second that they did, I would just use a polearm special and that would re-stagger them, and then I could go back into charged heavies. And, you know, while it is kind of funny to be like, haha, boss can't fight back, I definitely think it speaks to the balance of the game when you're able to just abuse enemies like that to the point where the game is completely devoid of any real challenge. This was only exacerbated as I worked my way towards the end of the game and got stronger and stronger to where there were certain bosses that I would just fire off my laser like 4 times and they would be dead. And I know you'll probably say, well, hey, you're playing a magic build. That's what you should expect. You're playing a magic build. You should be strong with magic. But at the same time, I could also just go ahead and get this up and just walk up to the boss and just outright whack them for about 20 seconds with the occasional dodge, and the same boss would also be dead. So whether I was using my spells or I was using my character's raw combat potential, the challenge just wasn't really there for me. And so that's definitely something that it just felt lacking as time went on. You finally uncover a new boss, you're excited to see what it has to offer, and then it just kind of drops in a minute and you're like, huh, I guess that was all. Moving on from there, though, to talk about the overall world design, I will say I really like how much verticality is going on in this world. There's a lot of little secrets where you might see something below, or a ledge that you're not sure if you can drop to, but you can drop to, or things like invisible platforms. And so a lot of the little tricks that we have come to expect from Souls games are definitely alive and well here. And so there were parts of the exploration which I really, really enjoyed. At the same time, the overall world design I felt was a little bit lacking. And so to describe this, there's basically a couple of main zones, and you end up looping back to those main zones. And so there's a lot of recursion throughout the world, but I felt it was overdone. So like we have the sewer zone, we have the zone where we're at right now, like the canyons. We had, a city zone, and like more often than not, I would end up getting looped back to a zone. And my immediate impression was like, wait a minute, haven't I been here before? This looks super familiar. I feel like I've been here. I feel like I know what this is. And, it just ended up kind of taking away from the overall exploration vibe, because I kept stumbling into areas and being like, hang on a second. Then I'm backtracking and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, this is somewhere I've been before. I know where we're at. So, it's a little bit of a mixed bag here, because on one hand, I do like the layout of certain areas, and I especially got to give them credit for the verticality, because I think they did an excellent job. Like we just came down into this thing and we can work our way all the way back up to a building that was inside upstairs to get some loot that we could only see from the outside while we were up there. Stuff like that, I love it. That's super, super cool. Another one, like, check this out. You make your way all the way down here, and you're working your way on up, and then you're like, well, hang on, I see something over here in the corner, and there's just a whole little nook that's tucked away back here. So there are tons of little secrets to discover and ledges that you can roll off that might not look like they go anywhere, but they do go somewhere. And that is something that I really enjoyed, but I wish there was a bit less recursion in the world. And probably more than anything, I wish some of the zones just had a little bit more diversity, because like when you go back into the sewers for like the 5th time, you're like, huh, it's this again. Okay, well, another trip in the sewers. I guess it is what it is. Talking about the story a little bit, I'm going to be honest, I was not a big fan of the story here. So the overarching story, to be honest, I'm still not entirely clear on it. From what I gathered, there's a focus on basically AI. Humanity ends up becoming extinct. AI essentially takes over, and it's, the remnants of humanity in this civilization trying to get by. And there is a very big brain overarching story behind it. And in true Souls fashion, it's told through a lot of little notes and things that you'll find throughout the world. But while I felt like I had a good idea of what I was going on, when I actually made it to the end of the game, there were some big revelations that threw half of my theories out the window, and I was just sitting there kind of dumbfounded, this really doesn't make any sense. None of this is clicking right now. And at that point, I inevitably ended up just kind of losing interest in the story, because I'm like, man, I've been working towards objective A, and then they're like, congrats, you have objective C has been accomplished. Let us tell you things. And you're like, wait, what? What about this other stuff? Are we just gonna not talk about that other stuff? And I do think the NPC quest lines were pretty entertaining for the most part. But the story, there were a lot of times where it just kind of felt disjointed, and it felt like we were going a bit all over the place. And I don't know. I feel like the times where we did get story, it was just basically narrative dumps from the NPCs. So I think there's some definite improvements that could have been made there. And I guess the the closing point on that would be that if you're buying this expecting some type of compelling story, you know, it's not going to be there. And like I said, only one ending that I got. Maybe if you go through the other endings, there's more puzzle pieces that fall into place, but it did not feel that way while I was playing it. Moving on to the graphics, obviously we have anime stylized graphics here, a bit reminiscent of Code Vein, and I'm actually a fan of that. You know, I'm not really all that picky when it comes to graphics. The textures are pretty simple in some areas, but there's a decent amount of detail on them. Like you can see the buildings, they have this like nice corroded type thing going on. You can see like rebar that's starting to stick through and whatnot. So overall, I think the graphics were definitely acceptable for what they were looking to achieve here. Obviously, this doesn't have any mind-blowing graphics, and it is stylized type graphics, but if you're okay with that, I think you'll be okay with the product. There wasn't any like, you know, major like, oh, that texture looks like just straight garbage. There wasn't anything like that. I think they did a fine job with the graphics here. Talking about audio, oof, this one gets a bit problematic. So there were quite a few audio bugs. I'm going to say that up front. We're going to talk more about that when we get into the bug section of things. So for now, let's just talk more about like overall sound design. Boss music for the most part was just not really memorable. I know this comes up a lot for me, and I feel like, you know, unless it's got that. I think the thing is, Souls games have spoiled us so much when it comes to music with like the epic Latin original scores that they come up with, that, you know, there's very few games I feel that impress me with music these days. Like Souls games, Final Fantasy, Stellar Blade actually I think had one of the best soundtracks in ages, but you know, there was not a banger of a soundtrack here. In terms of the sound effects and whatnot, I think they did a pretty nice job. You know, we can hear our weapons hitting, but it doesn't really have like the weight that you would feel. You know, not to bring up the comparison because Kazan does release at the same time, but like, you know, like stuff like that sounds a little juicy, but then when we're like hitting stuff, it very has like a slap, you know, like I actually get this thing to stand still. There's like a little bit of gushiness to it, but it doesn't really feel like there's much weight behind those attacks. And it's a longsword, so you know, I know I'm not expecting great sword type noises here, but I'm just like smack, 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 smack. I do think that the spells sound really good. That sounds pretty satisfying. Our blade, like. But overall, I mean, the sound effects just didn't really stand out. But, you know, bugs aside, I think it would be fair to say that there was nothing like fundamentally wrong with the audio. I think it just ended up feeling very, very average, I think would be a good way to describe it. So what about length and price? Well, I came in at, as I mentioned, I say 13.5 hours for a first playthrough. Game is priced in at 35. It obviously has New Game Plus and all that. So I think especially with the cheaper price point, I think there's something here that people can possibly enjoy. It's on sale right now, even for launch, so it's like actually like 32 or something. But especially for what is being offered here, I think at $32, it's a pretty fair offering. I definitely would have liked to see a little bit more in terms of like the boss strength, because that's certainly what tends to pull me into games like this. But, you know, if we're just looking at raw play time per price point, singular playthrough clocking in at a bit over 13 hours, and then assuming you're going to go for other endings, you're going to be looking closer to, you know, 25 or potentially even 30 if you're looking to, you know, like get a platinum achievement or whatnot. So I think they did a decent job there if we are looking at how many hours of gameplay you're going to get out of the price, especially given the cheaper price point. Now on to the big one, bugs and performance. Now, usually I like to hold off on making bugs too much of a big thing in my review, because, you know, bugs can typically get fixed up, and usually they will get fixed up. And I would sincerely hope the bugs I encountered here do get fixed up. But there were some bugs that were probably some of the most egregious bugs I have encountered in recent history. And, you know, I have the full Let's Play series done, clocked in at 27 episodes. You'll be able to see all this stuff. Just to list a couple of these, so later on we're in a zone and there's like some big thing off in the distance, and so you can like constantly hear like big earthquakes, like big tremors happening. And what would happen is the whole screen would shake, a very aggressive screen shake effect, and it was so aggressive that it would occur, and given this would occur roughly every like 20 to 30 seconds, and when it would occur, my entire camera would shift under the ground to where I couldn't even see what I was doing. So it's just like boom, 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 and I'm suddenly looking under the level for a second, and then boom, 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 and I'm looking under the level for a second. This was occurring while I was fighting enemies. It was occurring in a boss fight, and it got to the point I was like, dude, like this needs to stop. This is really bad. Like, I can't even play the game like this. This is the most aggressive screen shake I think I've ever encountered. And thankfully that was just that one area. So, you know, really, really bad bug, but in the grand scheme of things, minor. Probably one of the bigger ones though is there was this weird sound bug that I started getting that would remove all ambient sounds from the game. So like the footsteps, the background music, all of that would just stop. I would still have like the sounds of combat, but everything else just completely disappeared. And the only way to address that was to just reboot the game. And I ended up encountering this probably 4 or 5 times in my playthrough. There were times where it would pop up in boss fights. There were times where it would pop up during zone transitions. And it got pretty annoying, you know, because you're playing the game, you're moving along, you're, you know, going on this adventure, and then all of a sudden it's just like, oop, no sound. And you're like, man, now I gotta find somewhere to I gotta find a branch, I gotta rest at, I gotta reboot this game. Like, it's weird. And I don't know what was going on with that. It was not clear to me what may have caused it. Like, there wasn't any one thing that stood out as a consistent variable between when this happened. But regardless, it was pretty obnoxious. And then the third and perhaps the most egregious bug I encountered was at near the end of the game. I proceeded into the final boss area, and the world just failed to spawn. And when I mean failed to spawn, I mean like the world just wasn't there. I just spawned into a black room and immediately fell to my death. And I was like, hey, that's weird. And then as I respawned, I fell to my death. And I was stuck just respawning and falling to my death. So rebooted the game, figured that would fix it. Nope. Continued to respawn and fall to my death. Tried rebooting again, still happened. Finally, I went and I revalidated the game on Steam, and it recovered a file that I guess had been missing, and then it suddenly started working. You know, given I had been playing for hours before this point and didn't encounter anything, so I don't know how it lost a file and then had to go and retrieve it. But you know, that was really bad, because the other thing is, by design, the way this works is you have different nucleuses, and the way these work is your retention rate dictates how much of your experience you keep when you die. So if I were to die with this, I'm going to keep 85% of it, 15% is gone for good. And your absorption rate is reflective of how much you get from killing an enemy. So if an enemy is going to drop 100 and I have 70, I'm only going to pull 70 in. But, you know, I get to keep more when I die. So, of course, I ended up using this thing, which I would lose half my souls or whatever on death, but I have a 98% absorption rate, which was really nice because it allowed me to level up really quickly. High risk, high reward. But then you encounter a bug like that where the game just continually drops you into the abyss, and suddenly you go from like 110,000 souls to like 50 in, you know, 4 or 5 deaths, because you're just being cut in half repeatedly. There was also one area in particular that I'll call out. I won't say it was bugged, but there was one particular area which was, it kind of reminded me of going down into, you know, going down and trying to get the fingerprint shield in Elden Ring, and you just have those crazy suicidal drops. And, you know, it was just pain. It was pain, because not only do we have these crazy drops, but it's a lot of, like, you know, jumping across thin steel beams. And I definitely think that got to a point where I was like, all right, I'm over. This is no longer fun right now. This entire area is just genuinely frustrating. And I still felt compelled to do it because I knew there was going to be content down there. And sure enough, there was content down there that was really important to do. And so, you know, it's just areas like that kind of, they took away from the overall experience. But so what are my final thoughts here? Honestly, as much as I hate to say it, this, for me, this probably clocks in at about a 3 out of 5. Early on in the playthrough, I think I might have leaned more towards a 4 out of 5, but as time went on and the sound bug became more prolific and the bosses became easier, and I just started you know, steamrolling through content, it got to a point where I was just kind of like, all right, well, here we go. Like I would just, you know, run in. Okay, here's a boss. Let me just, you know, oh, he hit me. Let me just boop, boop. Okay, let me just boop, boop, boop. Like, you know, like you just don't gotta really try. So much so that like actually my heals for the longest time, I actually had the misconception that the, you know, feeding your seeds to the branches, I thought it was similar to like kindling a bonfire in Dark Souls. And so I was like, okay, well, I should only use these when I'm going to struggle at a boss. So for the longest time, I actually played the game with only like 3 or 4 base heals, and then, you know, the heal over time options that you can find or buy throughout the world. So when I say like there just really wasn't a challenge here, I mean, I'm talking about playing the game with half the available healing for a vast majority of it, and then near the very end being like, oh, I can just spend all of these. And you know, I went from, I think it was 5 or 6 heals all the way up to 10, like an hour before the final boss. And was like, oh, well, that was kind of a dumb mistake. And I think the sad thing is, in retrospect, it didn't really matter, because even when there was a boss where I died because I ran out of healing, most of the time I only needed like one more attempt to kill it anyway. And so, you know, I mean, there's definitely some fun to be had here. I don't think it's a bad game, but I do think this game could have probably taken some more time in the oven to polish, especially to get rid of the bugs that it ended up occurring throughout my playthrough. I think the overall difficulty in terms of how easy it is to chain stagger enemies and just how strong your character is overall, I think that kind of took away from the excitement, you know, like that clutch feeling that you get when you play Souls games and you overcome adversity and you're beating that boss and you're like, yeah, got it. Like that feeling just didn't really happen here. I think the most exciting moment is there was like one boss in particular I was fighting, and I was like, oh, I think I'm going to try and parry this. And then I was like, okay, I think I got this. And then I did an attempt where I just parried every attack the boss did, and it was like a flawless kill in like a minute. And besides that one moment, most of it was just me kind of trouncing through the content. So, you know, at the same time, it's only $35. So I do think there's fun to be had here. I would just make sure you temper your expectations before going into it. So that's going to wrap things up for me. Regardless, I still have the Let's Play that's clocked in at 27 episodes. So if you want to see more about the game or check it out more before you buy it, obviously I'll have that up for y'all to check out. That is going to wrap things up for me. Thanks for coming by, and I'll catch you next time.